Three stories caught my attention today, and at first they appear to have almost nothing in common, because one involves the United States and Iran stepping back from military confrontation. Another involves young protesters in India adopting the cockroach as a symbol of resistance, while the third concerns Andy Burnham trying to persuade British voters that an entirely different way of taxing property might somehow be fairer than the system we already have. Yet when you place the three stories beside each other, a pattern begins to appear, and it is a pattern that says something interesting about how power works in the modern world, because governments still possess armies, police forces, tax departments, and enormous media operations. But increasingly they are discovering that having power is not the same thing as controlling what people believe that power means. The observer's mindset begins by resisting the temptation to decide immediately who is good, who is bad, or which side deserves to win, because the moment we enter one of those moral films, we stop examining the machinery behind the screen. Instead, we ask a more useful question: what behavior is each player trying to produce? What incentives are shaping their decisions, and what story must they tell in order to make those decisions appear successful? Let's begin with the United States and Iran, where both sides have paused their attacks after nearly 2 weeks of escalating conflict. Iran says it will continue the pause for as long as American bombing remains suspended, while President Trump can present the decision as evidence that military pressure forced Iran to change its behavior. Iran, meanwhile, can tell its own population that it resisted the most powerful military in the world without surrendering control of the Strait of Hormuz. The fighting has paused, oil prices have fallen sharply, and financial markets have responded with relief, although the underlying conflict remains unresolved. Reuters. Now notice what has happened here, because neither side needs to agree on what the pause means. They only need a version of events that allows their own supporters to accept it. The United States can say Iran backed down because American pressure worked. Iran can say America stopped bombing because Iranian resistance made continuation too expensive. The markets do not need to determine which story is correct, because traders are watching oil supplies rather than political theater, and when the immediate threat to those supplies appears to fall, prices move before the historians have even sharpened their pencils. This suggests that modern conflicts may not always end when one side defeats the other in the traditional sense. They may end when both sides construct a believable enough version of victory that allows them to stop. That distinction matters because an enemy with no acceptable exit can become more dangerous than an enemy offered a face-saving retreat. If Iran must publicly surrender, it has an incentive to continue fighting, but if it can claim that its resistance forced America to pause, it can step back without appearing weak. The same applies in the other direction, because if Trump can say that force produced the pause, he does not have to describe it as a compromise. In other words, the off-ramp may be made from language rather than concrete. There is a historical parallel here with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the public version said the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba, while the less visible arrangement also involved the eventual removal of American missiles from Turkey. Both leaders needed outcomes they could survive politically, and that meant the public story could not contain every detail of the private bargain. The first hidden rule of today's news, then, is that sometimes the most effective form of power is giving your opponent a story they can live with. The second story takes us to India, where a youth protest movement grew after an official used the word cockroaches to describe frustrated and unemployed young people. The intended message was obvious. These people were insignificant, undesirable, and perhaps not even worthy of being treated as individuals. Yet the insult did not work as intended. Instead of rejecting it, the protesters adopted it, built a satirical movement around it, and called themselves the Cockroach Janta Party. The campaign used memes, jokes, and irreverent humor to keep attention focused on leaked examination papers, unemployment, and corruption, eventually helping force the resignation of India's education minister, The Guardian. This is what happens when persuasion travels in the opposite direction from the one intended. The official believed he was lowering the status of the protesters, but he accidentally gave them a symbol. Worse still, he gave them a symbol with unusually powerful psychological qualities, because cockroaches are small and despised, but they are also famously difficult to eliminate. You can ignore them, stamp on them, and poison them, yet the cultural image suggests that they will still be there after everyone else has disappeared. That is a remarkable piece of accidental branding. Once thousands of people begin calling themselves cockroaches, the insult loses its ability to shame them. It becomes armor, and because humor travels easily through social media, the movement gains a communication system that the authorities struggle to control. A formal political slogan can be disputed, but a funny image is absorbed before the conscious mind has fully examined it. We have seen versions of this before. Political opponents use a contemptuous label, the target group adopts it with pride, and an attempted humiliation becomes a membership badge. The important variable is not whether the original insult was accurate, because insults of that kind are rarely intended as analysis. The real question is whether the target accepts the frame. The protesters refused the frame while keeping the word. That is the clever part. They did not argue, "We are not cockroaches," because that would have left the official in control of the conversation. Instead, they effectively said, "Very well, we are the cockroaches, and now you have to explain why there are so many of us." The government was no longer dealing with isolated students complaining about individual examination results. It was facing a shared identity through which millions of young people could recognize a common experience. This produces a second rule. If people can transform your insult into their identity, you may have accidentally organized your opposition for them. Our third story brings the pattern closer to home, because Andy Burnham has been talking about major decisions over social care and the future of council tax, with possible alternatives reportedly including a proportional property tax or a land value tax. There is a respectable economic case for changing the present system. Council tax bans in England are still based on property values from 1991, which is rather like deciding modern football league positions by consulting results from the season when Arsenal were still playing at Highbury and Leeds United were about to become champions. The strange thing is not that somebody wants to reform the system. The strange thing is that it has survived this long. Yet the political difficulty begins the moment the word reform turns into a number printed on somebody's bill. Burnham can say that the present system is unfair and that social care desperately needs investment, but fairness is one of those attractive political words that becomes considerably less attractive when it arrives with your address printed at the top. Research modeling one version of a land value tax suggests that many households could pay less, particularly in parts of northern England and deprived coastal communities, while owners of valuable land in London and the commuter belt could pay substantially more. The difficulty is that the winners may experience the change as a modest improvement, while the losers experience it as an attack on something they already own. Tax policy associates. This is an incentive imbalance, and politicians underestimate it at their peril. If a reform saves 2 million people a few £100, those people may be mildly pleased. If it costs 500,000 people several £1,000s, those people will become extremely motivated, form campaign groups, and appear on every available television program with a copy of their new bill. The emotional intensity is not evenly distributed. There's also a second-order effect involving house prices, because taxes on land or property do not merely collect money after the market has decided what something is worth. They can alter what buyers are willing to pay in the first place, which means a policy designed to make taxation fairer may also redistribute value between existing owners, new buyers, and different parts of the country. This does not automatically make the policy wrong. It simply means that fairness is not a neutral description of the proposal. It is the opening move in a persuasion contest over who should pay, who should benefit, and which starting point counts as legitimate. Burnham's problem is not simply designing a better tax. It is designing a story in which enough people believe the change is fair before their opponents design a more emotionally powerful story in which the government is coming for their home. And this is where our three apparently unrelated stories meet. America and Iran each need a version of victory that permits retreat. India's protesters took a hostile description and converted it into solidarity. Burnham must turn a redistribution of costs into a credible account of fairness. All three involve hard power somewhere in the background, whether that means missiles, police officers, or the legal authority to collect taxes, but the decisive struggle is over interpretation. Who looks strong? Who counts as the victim? Who is being treated fairly? Which description becomes the one people repeat? We often imagine that reality produces the story, although in public life the story also helps produce reality, because people make decisions according to what they think other people believe. Markets rise when investors expect other investors to feel safer. Protest movements grow when isolated individuals realize that their private frustration is widely shared. Tax reforms survive when voters believe the costs form part of a legitimate exchange rather than an arbitrary punishment. The observer's mindset is not about pretending that facts do not exist. It is about recognizing that facts enter human minds through frames, identities, and incentives, and once they are there, they begin changing behavior. The larger pattern may be that influence does not replace force, but determines when force can be used, when it must stop, and what everyone is permitted to call the outcome. That leaves us with 3 questions worth carrying into the next news cycle. What story is each side telling its own supporters? What behavior does that story make possible? And who benefits if we accept the frame before examining the system underneath it? Because the most revealing part of the news is often not the event everyone can see. It is the invisible permission structure around it, the story that allows a government to retreat while declaring victory, an insult to become a movement, or a new tax to be presented as justice. That is where the hidden system lives, and once you learn to look for it, the day's headlines stop appearing as separate events and begin looking like different scenes from the same human drama.